Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Declaration of Independence at the 21st century. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the Declaration of Independence at the 21st century, Dr. BLovett. Dr. BLovett is an historian at Tennessee State University, a professor of history at that institution. And of course, Dr. Lovett, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Well, thank you, Dr. Haney.
And to tell you, Dr. Lovett, how delighted we are to have you once again on this show to talk about the information that we know that you've got a lot of. As a matter of fact, we've got a number of shows that we've done with you, and some of the shows that go back to 1995. But we still believe that they're of very, very significance dealing with the kind of information that you delivered to us. And I often think about the African American and the Constitution of the United States. I think you did that show with us back in 1995.
Yes.
But still it is, I think, one of the best pieces of information dealing with the African American and the Constitution that we have. And we'd like to do the same thing with this Declaration of Independence show. As a matter of fact, we've had you with 2 or 3 other individuals to talk about this same topic, the Declaration of Independence, over the many years. And what we'd like to do today is to really make this the mother of all Declaration of Independence shows, in the sense that we believe that it is the Declaration of Independence at the 21st century, to give you an opportunity to talk about it from that perspective. But before we get into that, Dr. Lovett, let's talk about Dr. BLovett and to have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important in terms of leading you to where we are today.
Okay. Well, I'm a native of Memphis, Tennessee. I was born and raised in Memphis, finished Booker T. Washington High School. Went to Arkansas A&M State College for my bachelor's in history and political science. I went on from there to the University of Arkansas for my master's. Taught at Eureka College in Illinois, and came to Tennessee State University in 1973. Returned to the University of Arkansas in the meantime and finished my PhD degree in history. My dissertation was on the Negro Civil War in Tennessee, where I covered black soldiers in the Union Army, contraband camps, and the general life of African Americans in Tennessee during 1861 to 1866, when the Civil War was going on. That is mainly my specialty area. But since then, I have dealt in African American history, mostly in the 19th century, and lately I've been doing some research and writing in the 20th century. The latest book I'm completing is a book on the biography of the civil rights movement in Tennessee from about 1935 to the present. And I'm also working on a book on the history of Tennessee State University. And I just completed an article in a book from the University of Arkansas Press on James C. Napier, who was an African-American leader in Nashville, and did another chapter last year on William Edmondson. That is in a book called The Art of William Edmondson, published by the University of Mississippi University Press, 2000. And 1999, my major book, The African American History of Nashville, Tennessee, from 1780 to 1930, was published by the University of Arkansas.
And so, Dr. Lovett, you've quite a number of scholarly works in all of these areas dealing with the African American experience. But let's talk about the Declaration of Independence itself. What is this document that was issued in 1776 declaring independence and et cetera? Let's talk about it from that perspective until the end of this particular segment.
Well, the Declaration of Independence, of course, is a sacred document to Americans because it was the document that proclaimed independence from England. And at that time, as you know, England was the owner of and the controller of the 13 colonies, which were under British control. And around 1770, they began to rebel against the British. And that came down to outright war in 1775. And in 1776, Thomas Jefferson and others sat down to put their feelings and their philosophy about the revolution in writing. And that became the Declaration of Independence, where these colonies do declare their independence and all allegiance to the British Crown. In some ways, it was a propaganda document because there were arguments that the document should go all the way to proclaim against slavery as well, since it talked about the equality and the fraternity of man and man's right to freedom and so on as an individual. But the language was changed at the last minute to not anger those colonies that depended heavily upon slavery, especially Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina and the colony of Georgia in South Carolina, which are the southern colonies at that time, as well as Maryland had heavy slaveholding during that period of time. Thomas Jefferson himself, called the author of the Declaration of Independence, was a large slave owner, and he was from Virginia, of course. And so they watered the language down that all men are endowed with the unalienable rights, you know. Really, it was much stronger than that. But they compromised, and if you read the Declaration of Independence, it sort of lays the blame of slavery upon Britain and says, you know, that Britain is responsible for transporting all these alien persons from Africa, you know, over to North American continent. But nevertheless, the language could not be changed in such a way as to deny that all men had the right to freedom and equality. However, as you know, slavery continued to exist in the 13 colonies, and that, of course, was a contradiction of the document itself. Now, as you know, we beat the British in 1780, and for all practical purposes, the Revolutionary War was over. It wasn't until 3 years later, 1783, that the Treaty of Paris was signed, and that treaty between the British and the 13 colonies did give them independence and also gave them land all the way to the Mississippi River that had been under the British. And so they have their independence. As a result of that, many of the colonies were cognizant of the contradiction and the hypocrisy of the Declaration that they were not living up to. And so Massachusetts in 1780 outright abolished slavery. And then so did New Jersey and New York and some of the other northern colonies. But the southern colonies did pass some emancipation acts allowing masters to emancipate a slave if they wished, but not the state itself. And as a result, slavery continued right on up until we got rid of it with the bloody Civil War, 1861 to 1865.
And so, Dr. Lovett, and I think you mentioned slavery in connection with the Declaration of Independence on several occasions. Let's talk about, and of course we're getting ready, I would imagine, within the next minute or so for our first commercial break. But let's deal with the issue of slavery in the colonies that was impacted. Give us some numbers in reference to this as a group of individuals and why this group would be of some concern to the Constitution.
Well, during the Revolutionary War period of our history, and we call that period, you know, from about 1775 up until the time that we write the Constitution and implement the Constitution in 1789, the one that we live under now. And from 1789 up until about 1830, we call that the New Nation period, when we were building a nation as a result of that Constitution. And at that time, during the Revolutionary War period, African Americans, believe it or not, were about 1 out of every 4 persons in the 13 colonies. By 1790, they are still about 1 of every 4 persons in the colonies, and 90% of them are slaves. The northern states are passing acts to gradually get rid of slavery, gradual abolition acts as we call them. The southern colonies are doing a little bit, but then along comes the cotton gin, along comes the demand for textiles in Europe, and slavery explodes in the South.
Let me interrupt here for this short commercial break, after which we'll come back and we'll allow you to continue that conversation. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is the Declaration of Independence at the 21st Century, and we're talking to Dr. Bobby Lovett from the Tennessee State University History Department in reference to that. And of course, Dr. Lovett, before we had our first commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to talk about African Americans and the Declaration of Independence. I think you've given us some information relative to slavery during that period, but let's allow you to pick up there and to give our audience over the next 8 minutes the information that you think that they ought to have in reference to appreciate what this document was all about and the impact that it had upon African Americans.
Well, you know, I said that, you know, there was a contradiction in the way that the Founding Fathers acted and what the Declaration of Independence said. Northern colonies did try to correct that by passing gradual abolition acts that eventually got rid of slavery in the northern colonies by 1820, some 30 or 40 years after the American Revolution. Remember that African Americans had fought on both sides. They fought in the Continental Army under George Washington, although he reluctantly allowed them to because he was a slave owner. And of course, fighting in the army would, you know, entice slaves to run away from the plantations. In fact, George Washington lost 90% of his slaves during the Revolutionary War. But a great number of African Americans fought on the British side, because Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, proclaimed that any person, regardless of color, who would join Her Majesty's forces against the rebellion would be declared free. Now remember, at that day and time that about 70% of all Americans were enslaved, not just African Americans or Americans from Africa, but 3/4 of all of the colonists that came from Europe, they came in bondage. They were either redemptioners under redemption contracts. They either came as convict labor contract, and they came as indentured servants. So what Lord Dunmore was appealing to was these persons, not just black persons, but white persons as well, who were enslaved. 3/4 of Americans came to the 13 colonies in some form of bondage or another, whether they were black or white. And keep in mind that color was not significant then as it is today. And racial division was not as significant as it is today in 2001 and 1780. So African Americans believe they too deserve freedom. So when the British lost in 1783 with that treaty I mentioned that ended the war officially, thousands of African Americans left with the British forces on their transports. Some of them went and settled in Nova Scotia, that part of northeastern Canada today, and a great number of them went to London and Britain itself. Others were resettled in what we call Sierra Leone by the British in 1787, about 4 years after the treaty was approved. So African Americans believe that they too, you know, had won the war. They had fought for freedom. Those who remained behind and did not leave with the British, which were most African Americans. And so they were celebrators of July 4th celebrations more than anybody else. In fact, in the South, African Americans celebrated July 4th more than white Americans did in the South after the Civil War, because many Southerners shunned the July 4th celebration because of the war and the Confederacy. And so it was a long time before you really had a lot of white Southerners celebrating the July 4th celebration again, really until the 20th century. For a long time after the war, for 35, 40 years, they shunned it. And it would be African Americans who would have July 4th parades and picnics. And they would use these parades and picnics as civil rights movements. They would have signs saying that we are free too and all those kinds of things. So African Americans really in the South have been more loyal to the July 4th celebration than have other Southerners. In fact, we use July 4th as family reunion time. And we also use the other Emancipation Day when the British emancipated all the slaves in the British Empire in 1834, August of 1833-34. Many African American celebrations for family reunions, you notice, are in August. So we do our family reunions around July 4th and also around August 8th because August 8, 1833 was the first emancipation, when the British emancipated all the slaves down in the islands and the other British Empire.
You know, Dr. Lovett, often we hear of the word Juneteenth, June 19th.
Right.
And let's have you explain exactly what that was all about, because that's one of the dates that we hear often about this time of year. What does that mean, Juneteenth?
In fact, in the paper, Juneteenth celebration is coming up, or is already come up in Hatley Park in North Nashville, a couple of celebrations. But Juneteenth was June 19th, 1865, was the date that the Union Army notified slaves in Texas that the war was over and that they were free. Texas was a huge place, as you know, and most of slavery existed in the eastern part of Texas and some of it around the Gulf. But when the when the Union Army arrived in 1865 in Galveston, they, sent out the word that, slavery was over. So because Texas was not involved in the Civil War, that is, battles took place, things went on in Texas just like nothing had happened during the Civil War. So slaves were not told by their masters or anybody that Lincoln has passed the Emancipation Proclamation January 1st, 1863. It wasn't until June 19th that they found out, and so they celebrate June 19th. June 19th, or Juneteenth as they call it, is really a celebration for Texas slaves, although African Americans in other places find it convenient to celebrate Juneteenth, but it really is not an official date for us in Tennessee. We really did not get freed in Tennessee until March of 1865, because Tennessee was not under the Emancipation Proclamation, although the governor of the state, Andrew Johnson, did declare in October of 1864 that all slaves were free in Tennessee. So Juneteenth is symbolic for African Americans, but historically it really doesn't mean anything for us in Tennessee.
And of course, during the last 30 seconds that we have here, the big thing that freed all of the slaves was the 13th Amendment. Say something about that.
Well, the 13th Amendment was finally passed on December the 18th, 1865. Remember I said the legislature of Tennessee passed the bill in March of 1865. Several months later, the number of states required to ratify the 13th Amendment, December 18th, ratified it, and that got rid of slavery north and south.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Lovett, we're coming to the end of the second segment, after which we'll come back and give you an opportunity to talk about where the Declaration of Independence stands in the 21st century. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. The topic is the Declaration of Independence at the 21st century, and we're talking to Dr. Bobby Lovett, an historian at Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. Lovett, let's give you an opportunity over the last 5.5 or 6 minutes that we have here to deal with what might be considered the topic of this show, which is to say that this document was issued in 1776, but it had so many philosophical items in it that it still has some significance today, not only to us. So let's talk about that document as it stands today. Give us some directions in reference to this.
Well, to African Americans, the Declaration of Independence is a very important and sacred document, despite the contradictions of the Founding Fathers and even the Supreme Court over the years. As you know, in the Supreme Court case in the 1850s, Dred Scott case, a very conservative Supreme Court essentially said that African Americans were not citizens and therefore they had no rights and so on, which was absolutely untrue because they had fought in the American Revolution. There were many free African Americans who were citizens and voted for the ratification of the Constitution in 1788 and 1789. So all the historical evidence was contradictory to the racist pronouncements of the Taney Court in 1859. And since that time, we African Americans, whether through the NAACP or other civil rights movements, organizations, we have dealt with the Supreme Court and the Congress and state legislatures trying to justify denial of African American rights, saying they were not really citizens, and still African Americans today are fighting, for citizenship, because there's still that notion, today that there's one group of citizens here, you call those citizens with privilege, and they even have a title for them, they call them whites. And then they have another group of citizens here that are supposed to have less privileges, and they have a title for them, they call them blacks. And then they have the others in the middle, and they call them others, they call them Hispanic whites, or they give them all kinds of silly titles that no other country in the world does but us. And so the Declaration of Independence, the philosophy of it about the fraternity and the equality and the freedom of man is still as important today as it was in 1776. And if we are not careful, men will twist that document to have meaning only for themselves, as many people did from 1776 until we fought the Civil Rights Movement in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education case. But you will find that African Americans will celebrate the July 4th a holiday more than any other Americans, despite all of the oppression they suffer, despite they have to continuously fight for their voting rights and continuously fight for an economic fairness, a piece of the American pie, which has not been realized since 1776. African Americans making up 13% of the population in 2001, but they only have 3% of the wealth in the entire country. They live off 3%, and they're 13% of the people. So that particular fairness and equality in American society has not happened since 1776. Still, you'll see African Americans celebrating July 4th more than anybody else. They still believe the American dream and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution upon which we are governed will one day be fully realized for all Americans.
And of course, Dr. Lovett, when that brings to mind, when you talk about the disparities here, that brings to mind one of the great controversies in reference to the modern society, and that is reparation, etc. Why don't you make a couple of historical statements in reference to that over the last 2 minutes? Let's see if we can get through.
Well, the reparations movement, started really in the 1880s, and then it died out, which was about 15 years after slavery. There was a lot of talk about 40 acres and a mule, and the government was going to do this for African Americans and so on, and compensate them for 200 years of slavery. Their money and labor had been taken over that period of time. And now it has begun to rise again. And in the Congress, as you know, our city council passed a resolution supporting the resolution in Congress to do a study on reparations. What we would like to do historically, sociologically, economically, is to do a study to find out, is there a need for reparations? And number two, what should it be based upon, and how will the compensation be given? Whether it be monetary or free scholarships or no taxes for the next 10 years for that group of people. There are all kinds of ways to pay, reparations. Is the evidence out there? Of course, as we're finding out from insurance companies that cheated African Americans in slavery. There was insurance policies on slaves here in Nashville. As I point out in my book, The African American History of Nashville, published in 1999, I found insurance companies that actually insured slaves in the city of Nashville. And the city of Nashville owned slaves. It owned dozens of slaves that kept them in the workhouse, and they built the sewers that partly are what we use today. They built the streets, they cleaned the streets, and so on. So if you really get into the evidence of reparations, the city of Nashville would have to pay those descendants who were enslaved by the city. The state of Tennessee, railroads were built in this particular state using slave labor. So we can prove it. It's just how you're going to pay it. Okay,
Dr. Lovett, of course, let me thank you for coming by and giving us that excellent information. We're going to have you back to talk about reparations. Okay. Of course, we'll be back with our audience next week. Thank you and good morning.